Hey, I'm here with Marcus Daniel of HIA, touring professional as well. Marcus, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. I think this stuff's important.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I think kind of objective number one for us at the PTPA and in the mental fitness program is just to kind of raise awareness about, life on tour, potentially, the grind that players face and experience. And so I don't know if you want to just kind of give us a little bit of a snapshot of what life is and was on tour for you and, kind of share that with the players.
Sure. I mean, the first word that sort of jumps into my mind is loneliness. We are surrounded by each other pretty much every week we're on tour, but it is quite a lonely life. I think, especially coming from a country like New Zealand, or I think Australia is in that same boat. Uh, I didn't really get to go home from the start of the season until the end of the season. So, that's usually end of December until mid-October or early November, I was on tour and I couldn't go home, see my loved ones, see my family. Um, and it was my experience, at least, that you were friendly with a lot of people on tour, but there are actually very few people who felt like deep friends. And I think it makes sense in a lot of ways because you have to compete against those people. That you might next week have to do everything you can to basically, take food off their family's table, um, which makes it hard to have deeper relationships with other people on tour. So I think all of those things just lend to, yeah, a pretty deep and sustained feeling of loneliness on tour. And that's one of the biggest things that I struggled with. And then when you've got that as a baseline, and then you put the emotional roller coaster of being a professional tennis player on top of it, when you get to the valleys, like when you get to the low points, it's pretty hard to deal with.
That sounds really challenging, and it's definitely been my experience talking with professional players, a similar sense. Not many people necessarily are courageous enough to kind of say all that stuff out loud. So I really appreciate you kind of shining a light on that, the reality of life on tour. Like as you said, let alone there's no real significant off season, and it's difficult to improve and to develop while you're in the midst of all of that as well. Um, I'm really curious, you've done such great work with high impact athletes, HIA. When did that sort of come into your consciousness as to something that you wanted to pursue? And in a sense, how did that transform some of that loneliness that you're just describing, from living a little bit more of a life on purpose?
Yeah, I think there were sort of two stages to it. So the first stage was when I first started actually making money from tennis. So when I first started being able to cover expenses and feel like a tiny bit of job security that I could actually make a living from pursuing the sport. And for me, that happened, I think around the end of 2014, maybe start of 2015. So when I reached that point, I had this really strong urge to give back in some way because it's just a reality that sport is a selfish endeavor. You are taking from the world to try to make yourself better, and it's necessarily that way. Like we have to think that way, um, but it never sat perfectly with who I wanted to be outside of sport. And so when I felt like I had the ability to be able to balance the scales, give back a little bit, I wanted to take action on it. Um, but I didn't really know how to go about it. So, I didn't fully trust the charities that I'd grown up around. I wanted to do a bit of deeper research. And I came across this idea of giving effectively. And it sounds so almost like stupidly obvious when you spell it out, but it's basically just if you're going to give, whether it's your time or your money, it makes sense to try to do as much good as you can possibly do with whatever you give. And that's just a no-brainer. But what that leads you to in the charity space is trying to focus on the top 0.1% of charities that do the most good per dollar that they spend on whatever cause they're trying to affect. Um, and it's really, really hard to find those charities. So I went pretty deep down the rabbit hole, and there are some incredible research organizations that spend tens of thousands of hours a year trying to find those opportunities. So I looked through their research, I listened to their recommendations, and started donating to those charities. Um, and that felt good. Um, but I sort of, I made the donations, and then a week later I'd forgotten about it, and life was going on as per usual. And then the next year, I think this was maybe 2015 or 2016. I can't remember exactly. I came across the idea of pledging a percentage of income to charity, and that felt pretty scary. But I don't know. I've always quite enjoyed leaning into uncomfortable things, and I decided to dip my toe in the water and make a 1% pledge of my income for that year to charity. And the thing that was really a pleasant surprise for me was the moment that I internally made that pledge. I felt like my relationship to tennis changed a little bit, because if you make a one-off donation, it's done, it's an action, and then you move on. If you make a percentage pledge, it means that doing something for something way bigger than yourself becomes a part of your daily life. It means that a small part of every hour I spend on the practice court or in the gym, and especially a small part of every minute I spend fighting it out on a match court, is for something much bigger than myself. And I can quite honestly say that I think making that pledge probably added a few years onto my tennis career, because even though it started out as a 1% pledge, like it started out tiny, I built that up over time. And in 2021, I believe I made a commitment to donate at least 10% for the rest of my life. And that probably sounds quite scary to a lot of people. It feels great, and it's not affecting the quality of my life at all. It's actually improving the quality of my life. But that's sort of a digression. Like that commitment to making a small part of your day to day for something bigger than yourself was just so powerful for me, and it put so much more meaning on running around after a little ball for a living. And my purpose that I found was giving to charities that I thought did amazing work. I don't think that's the only purpose that you can find. Like, I think a lot of people, when they have kids or when they have a family that needs support, like that can be the deeper purpose that people play for. But for me, finding a purpose that really felt deeply meaningful for me was it 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 put into perspective a lot of the difficulties of tour life, and it made most, if not all of those difficulties easier to deal with because of the perspective. Um, so yeah, that's a bit of a rant, but it's very, very true for me. And then how high impact athletes come into it was in 2020 when the tour stopped, when COVID hit. I think at that stage I'd pledged 8% of my income, and I think I bumped it up to 10% the year after. But when the tour stopped, I essentially lost my income. I lost my job. So I didn't feel like I could do any more financially, but I had all this time with nothing really to do, like sitting on my ass during COVID, and I had time to think. And the realization that came up was, like, I'd been donating for many years at that stage, and I felt good about it, but I'd never spoken about it publicly. And the reason I hadn't spoken about it was because I didn't want to be sort of cut down to size. I heard this beautiful phrase recently. I think it's an old Japanese saying that something like the nail that sticks out gets pounded down. And so we have a similar thing in New Zealand, where you just, like, you don't want to sort of put yourself out there with this sort of thing. The painful part of the realization was, by not speaking about this stuff, I might have left some impact on the table. Maybe some people would have died who didn't need to die because I hadn't spoken about these incredible charities. And so that realization was what led to High Impact Athletes. Was I feel really strongly about these charities and what they're trying to do, and being able to help as an athlete. And if I feel that way, then maybe some other athletes will too. So I decided to try and make a rallying point, like a community around giving back really effectively. And honestly thought it was just going to be me pestering my friends on tour to see if they thought these charities were cool too. But very quickly it became something bigger than that. And now we have over 230 athletes around the world, have moved well over $1 million towards these charities, and it seems to be just at the start of what we're able to do. So I'm really proud of all the athletes who have joined up and committed their resources to this and their voices, because it's as a collective that I think we can really do some good. But yeah, sorry, that's a really long-winded answer, but for me, finding a purpose was was a pretty amazing thing during my tennis journey, and I can only imagine that it would be beneficial for everyone on the tennis tour to find some sort of deeper meaning around what they're doing on a tennis court.
Hmm. Such a powerful story, Marcus. I can't believe that you know, the ability for you to be able to kind of manifest that kind of change from the inside out is really, really potent. I guess the last thing I might ask is just sort of what would you say to, current tour level players who might be watching this right now, as maybe a way for them to explore or consider, kind of investigating whether high impact athletes is the right place for them, or what sort of advice or counsel might you give players that are in that state of loneliness in the grind currently?
Well, that second part's a big question. In terms of the loneliness, I think maybe one thing that would help is to know that I think that's very normal. Like I think a lot of tennis players are lonely, and we don't show it because we don't want to show a chink in the armor. This is a competitive world that we live in, and we want to be seen as invincible, and we don't want to show any cracks. But the reality is that I think most people are lonely on tour, and reach out to the resources that you have. Like I think the resource you're providing here is really cool. Reach out to your family. So yeah, on the loneliness side, I think just realizing that you're not alone in feeling it, and then trying to lean on the resources that are available. Um, and then on the charity side, yeah, look, if people are interested in the type of charity work that we do through high impact athletes, please do reach out to me. Uh, it'd be easy to find my number through the tennis community, or through the High Impact Athletes website. Um, I think an important thing to say is that we as a nonprofit, we don't take any percentage of what any athlete decides to contribute to these charities. We've been very, very conscious of keeping the buckets separate of the service that we provide to athletes, and connecting them with charities, and the way that we fund our operation is entirely separate from that, with a group of high net worths and some grant funding. So I think, trust is paramount in the charity space, and we want to be really clear and transparent about how we operate. But yeah, if you're interested in getting involved in charity, then I can confidently say that we have some of the best recommendations in the world based on the best available research in the world. So if you care about impact and care about, getting the biggest bang for your buck in terms of helping the world, then we're a good spot for it. But just on a more basic level, like I I have read that doing something for others is one of the only guaranteed ways to make yourself more happy. It's quite counterintuitive, but if you do something for someone else, it actually has a real positive impact on your own sense of well-being. I've felt that myself. Sometimes at the end of the year, giving away 10% of your income is scary. It's a scary amount, but when it's gone, it feels great. Like when you think about the good that it's going to do, it feels great. Um, so yeah, that's probably that potentially a personal thing, but again, like just giving of yourself, whether it's your money or your time or your positivity, whatever it is, like I think that's another great tool for people to use.
Beautiful, Marcus. Thank you for sharing so much of your inspirational story, and more importantly, thank you for your contribution to the world. It's really powerful, and I know it's definitely affected me just hearing your story. And if anybody out there is listening, feel free to reach out to me as well. I can put you in touch with Marcus and get you connected with his services, or if you want to explore other ways to give and serve, feel free to reach out about that as well. Marcus, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Damon. Really appreciate it, man.